So thank you very much to ERF for the invitation to be here. This is always a pleasure for me to come to this part of the world, and I'm never cease to be amazed by the things that happens in MENA. So it's a great pleasure to be here. Let me give you an idea of what I'm going to talk about. This is coming from a mandate from our executive director of the ERF. My friend Ibrahim El-Badawi gave me a call and said, can you talk about this stuff and about the new normal and what can Latin American countries show in terms of how to deal with the new normal and the end of the global recession of 2009-2010. So the talk is going to be about the new normal, what's the world economy going to look in the new normal era, what is it in there for resource-rich countries. My country, Chile, is well endowed of minerals, and if anything, it resembles most of the countries in the MENA region. And let me talk, by the end of it, I will talk about macroeconomic regimes in the world under the new normal era, and then I leave a lot of questions open for the policymakers and the authorities to actually deal with it. Okay? Now, let me concentrate for a couple of minutes on the new normal. I truly tried to find the definition of what is the new normal and went about to look for it. And what I found is that there is not a single definition that could be applied to what we're trying to talk. It might be a previously unfamiliar or a typical situation that has become standard, usual, or expected. So something has changed, and we believe it's going to be the new standard of living. So when in doubt, I guess we have to call the IMF. and then I checked about a decade worth of the World Economic Outlook, which is issued once a year or twice a year by the IMF. And trying to look if the IMF would come up with a characterization of what used to be the situation and what is going to be now, or if there's been major changes in the perception of the status of the world economy that could be termed a new normal. And I didn't have any luck. The IMF mainly focused on two things when defining the new situation. One is growth, and the other one is financial risks. On growth, before and after the global recession, growth was always lower than desired, lower than expected, or lower than needed, but never the right thing. And financial risks are always higher, inevitable, ominous, lurking, never quite under control. So I couldn't actually make heading on this. In most of the papers I reviewed the literature, it is defined very vaguely as the post-global crisis period, but it seems to me that this is really very wide. Christine Lagarde, the IMF executive director, has this fantastic saying. She said, 6 months ago, I warned about the risk of a new mediocre, low growth for a long time. Today, we must prevent that new mediocre from becoming the new reality. So the IMF, in fact, is thinking of a long period of low growth. If we look at the US, the new normal is defined as a permanent downward departure from America's historical 3% growth rate. So there is significant evidence. The paper by Fernald and co-authors is probably the newest on this. It's saying that the secular decline in TFP growth due to slow growth of innovation and a declining labor force participation. As the population gets old, the labor force participation is reducing. So basically, it's a very self-centered kind of definition of the new normal in US terms by low growth and due to the decline in innovation and population. Another self-centered part of the world is China, where they define the new normal as a permanent decline in GDP growth from an annual growth rate of around 10% prior to the crisis to 7% in the following years, and to a envisioned 5.5% by around 2023. And concomitant to this, this decline in GDP growth, the Chinese are expecting to rely more and more on internal sources of growth as opposed to foreign trade and foreign investment. So for these two poles, we get a very different perception on what is it, the new normal. And for commodity exporters, we could define the new normal in a very different way. It's very clear that the super cycle of prices had come to an end, and it might perhaps signal that prices are going to be low permanently or for a long time, and that it's going to be much more uncertain. So we have three different definitions of what is the new normal. None of them is very easy to grasp, and none of them actually matches very well with the data. So let me show you what is the world economy in this vaguely defined new normal era. This is the prospects of growth from the IMF, from the last World Economic Outlook of April. And it basically indicates that the fund is expecting the world to grow at around 3.7% for the next 6 years. Advanced economies will increase slightly less, and as the built-in capacity begin to be fully utilized, the growth rate of the economies are going to be around 1.5%. Emerging economies, on the other hand, will have a very strong and vigorous growth of around 5%. Is this a new normal for emerging economies? It's very rosy, I would say. And the MENA region is going to grow at around 3.5% if the IMF prospects are okay. Now, if we look at these numbers in historical terms, and we take a long view on the past, this is the growth rate of the world in the last 55 years, okay, since 1960. So the blue line there is the average for the entire period, excluding the prospects, which is around 3.5%. So basically what the IMF and the rest of the prospects are very similar. I took the IMF just as an example. What we are saying, what these forecasts are saying, is that the economy is going to grow around half a point higher than the historical average of 3.3%. Now, this number actually hides the fact that population growth in the 1960s was much higher than now, and therefore GDP per capita is growing now faster, and is expected to grow faster than it used to be in the last 55 years. Therefore, this new normal, at least for the next 6 years, doesn't look as bad as it sounds when you read the press and when you read the comments from authorities. MENA, unfortunately, is growing fast, but it's not catching up, and this is an issue that should be kept in mind because it's really very important. Now, the other hand of the other side of this is the financial risks. And when you look at the financial risks, there's continuous uncertainty in global equity markets, despite the very low volatility of those assets and the low interest rates. So what I have here is a graph showing the volatility of the US stock market, which is the very thin line that you barely see, probably most of all if you're sitting in the back. And the strong line is the change in equities. The other one is the change in treasuries. And what we see is that from an historical point of view, taking again a 50-year horizon, we are in a period of very low interest rates and very low volatility in equity markets. And the interest rates are down there. This is the first time in 50 years where the real interest rates are very close to zero, instead of the maybe 2, 3, or 4% per year that we were used to. So in the financial sector, what we have is that there is uncertainty, but it's not really showing in the numbers. So it must be coming from somewhere else. So let me give you an idea of where it might come from. One of the problems the financial sector is anticipating is that with the monetary policy normalization and the end of the quantitative easing in most markets, there's going to be a financial market correction. And that correction will be probably costly, and if not very costly, at least very uncertain in what's going to happen. There is a buildup of financial debt, which is now around $165 trillion, which is obviously the result of very low interest rate and a lot of money available for being lent. And the key question here is not how big the debt is how will the different type of assets that have benefited from this quantitative easing going to react once interest rates begin to come up. That's a key issue that is probably generating uncertainty in the market, and we will see in the future what happens with it. There is a second source of uncertainty, and it comes from the changes in the US tax policy, particularly the corporate taxes. How is the economy going to react to lowering corporate taxes? But in addition to that, not only what's going to happen with the equities and the value of the firms, is what is going to be the impact of these measures on the US deficit, and in particular on the rising US public debt. At this point, the public debt in the US is around 75% of GDP, and the total debt of the country is a little over 100, which is the highest for all advanced economies. And with this changes affecting corporations and affecting the debt of the US government, there are additional sources of policy uncertainties. Some of these come from geopolitical and globalization risks, which are very important, and this is an area of the world where the geopolitical risks are seen every day. There is a retreat from cross-border economic integration. The Trump-China clash has become a wide-open trade war, and Russia has been reacting. The EU is reacting. Almost every country is, in one way or another, being affected by the clash between these two giants. At the side of this, there are ultra-nationalist European political parties aiming at anti-integration, anti-immigration, against raising protectionism and populist measures. The EU is on the course of finalizing, or at least advancing, on the Brexit. But with the Brexit comes also the claims of Scotland, Catalonia, and Greece to actually leave the EU. There are regional conflicts and wars. Of course, the Middle East, Russia, China, perhaps the neighbors, North Korea and South Korea. All these are areas where there are risks from a geopolitical. My part of the world, Latin America, is not immune to this. We have had a significant problem with, not problem. We have had the shame of realizing how deep corruption has affected all countries. The most famous one is the Lava Jato trial against corrupt Brazilian politicians, but we figured out that this corruption in Brazil had actually spread throughout all of South America, and it's becoming a very complicated political problem, leading to two things. One is political polarization, and the other one is the swings from left to right, which in a polarized case means that you're swinging from the extreme left to the extreme right, government after government. The last election in Mexico proves exactly that. You swing from the right, from a relatively moderate right to a relatively non-moderate left. Okay, what's new? From my point of view, nothing. Sorry. All of this we've been seeing for the last, I don't know, nth years. Okay? This is nothing new. So we need to add further risks to make it more interesting for us, okay? Because at this point, everything that I have been saying is relatively well known. This is an area in which risks are important, can be dramatic, and we are not doing anything to actually face this, at least not from my point of view. Technological changes will alter dramatically the production landscape and even the social contract in a number of countries. These are the kind of things which are coming: robots, drones, 3D printing, artificial intelligence. All that, and the other 4 or 5 things there, all that will change the way in which we produce, will change the way in which the factors are going to be paid, will change eventually the way in which the government will relate to the constituencies, because a lot of things can happen. Let me show you one. Even though these changes may be slow, artificial intelligence will make massive changes in the labor market. In a recent paper by, it's called the McKinsey report, what they do, they try to figure out how many positions in the labor market will disappear, being replaced by machines. So automation will take the place of workers in the labor market. And they calculated, it's a very relatively simple calculation, how many work hours, current work hours, could be automated in the next 10 or 20 years. Okay, so this is going to be for 2030. 23% of all positions in the US will disappear. 16% in China, 26 in Japan, and 24 in Germany. Okay? These are countries where China is not that much, but the other 3 countries where wages are very high and labor costs are very high, therefore they call for replacement for machines. And machines can actually do all this stuff. So this means the labor force in the US could be anything above 200 million. 23% of those 200 million workers will have to switch positions, be retrained. This is a kind of shock that we're expecting to happen. Now, in the rest of the countries, this is going to be smaller because wages are lower, and therefore there is no incentive to automate everything. Okay? But in Mexico, in Chile, or in Brazil, it's going to be anything above 10% of the labor force. And in this area, it's going to be 10% in Morocco and Egypt for the same reasons that is 10% in Latin American countries, but it can be much higher in Kuwait or Oman, where the wages are much higher. Therefore, this is a massive shock that will change the way in which labor market works, in which workers are being paid, in which resources are being allocated for production. Now, this is the midpoint scenario. There is a more pessimistic scenario with these numbers goes up much faster. Okay? So that's one thing. The other thing is that it will create and will generate substantial changes in the way in which firms outsource the production or vertically integrate to lower the cost of production. And the same will be for spatial allocation between firms in different countries and globalization. The key question of all this is, are our regulatory frameworks ready for this? Is the doing business regulation thing being adapted to this kind of change, or are we still looking at what happened in the 80s, the 90s, or the 2000s? Those years are gone and not going to come back. And if anything is new and the new normal, is that this kind of shock will be far more important and far more pressing than what they have been so far. So I find this to be a legitimate new normal threat, but also an opportunity to change the way in which we are working. And let me take 1 minute to make you understand what I'm saying. During the last administration in my country, they passed a number of laws that actually go precisely in the opposite direction to this, making the labor market more rigid, less flexible, less adaptable, severing the connection between education and the labor force, basically because they wanted to empower the unions. Now, the unions are very good in the 50s or the 60s or maybe the 70s. But nowadays, with this kind of change, our producers are saying, well, if I can buy a robot and replace half of my workers, I'd rather have the robot than half of my workers. And we are seeing this every day in the more advanced firms, and it's going to happen. Therefore, what kind of regulation you pass makes a lot of a difference of how these shocks are going to affect you in the future. So I see it as an opportunity to actually review our regulations in the labor market and in the doing business area and come up with more sensitive and more fruitful kind of environment. Okay, what is the new normal for resource-rich countries? This is a little like foretelling the future, so I'm not very confident on this. Anyway, so would lower commodity prices and far more volatile commodity prices define the new normal? These are, I'm going to show you a graph, again, long-term perspective of commodity prices in real terms and taking as a reference point 2010. There you have it. The black line is energy, a combination of oil, gas, and coal. The dotted blue line are precious metals, basically gold and silver. The red line are other metals and minerals, and the green light is agriculture. Okay? What we can see is that even though the prices have declined around 30% in the last 10 years, they are much higher than they used to be in the long run. Okay? So the super cycle of prices may be over, but the prices are not low. And this thing is exactly the kind of thing that economists should not look at, right? Because these are prices, and what we care are not prices, they're profits. And the costs of these different commodities have gone down in the last 50 years. Okay? So the costs have been down, the prices have been up, and the profits of the companies and the profits of the governments must have gone up. So the long-term perspective is that we are not as poor as we think. Maybe we would like for this to be at the top, at 2010 level, yeah, fantastic. With oil prices at 115 or whatever, great. But that only happened for a couple of days or for a couple of weeks, and it's not the sustainable long-run level. So commodity prices in this sense are not low and are not envisioned to go down, as I will show in your future, in a couple of slides more. What about volatility? What I did is I took the long-run trend with a simple filter and then compute deviations, and I plotted this into this graph by decades. So in the first column is the volatility of energy, the second one agriculture, and so on and so forth. And what we see is that the volatility of energy is much higher than the rest of the goods, but it has not changed in the last 10 years compared to the previous periods. So it's as volatile as before. And it's not more volatile than minerals in the long run. They're very similar, actually. And that manufacturers don't have zero volatility. They do have volatility, and that volatility is not really much higher than that of agricultural goods or of raw materials. Therefore, more volatility in the commodity market doesn't seem to be exactly what the data is showing us for the last 10 years. Therefore, it's not new, and it's actually very normal. However, there may be a declining trend, because what I show you is what had been happening in the last 50 years. But what about the future? Well, there are some areas in which technological innovations might induce a lot of changes and affect resource-rich economies. One is new renewable energies, solar, wind, the rise of electric vehicles, and the appearance of new competitors with decreasing marginal costs, such as fracking in the oil industries. Will there be a secular decline in commodity prices after this? For energy, three areas seems to be important to keep in mind. One is less global demand. The second one is more global production. And the third one is the role of this. It's very difficult to anticipate the role of these disruptive technologies. Okay, I won't go into the non-energy. According to the energy outlook from BP, the last one, the only energies that will go up in terms of demand in the next 25 years or 20 years is renewables. All the rest will go down in terms of growth rates. Very little in the case of energy, a little more in the case of coal because of pollution and the like. But basically, these are very marginal growth rates for the sector. And therefore, what is expected is to have a peak in oil demand and afterwards a decline. When is exactly this peak? It depends on which paper you read. If you read BP, it's going to be around 2040. If you read the Japanese Institute for Energy Economics, then it's going to be during the 2030s. But there is this idea of a peak and then a systematic decline in the demand. Now, why would the demand probably decline? One is the substitution of a lot of fossil fuels for electricity. The prices of electricity-related items have declined significantly. I'll show a graph in a minute. And also because the OECD demand is going to go down by 2035. These are estimates of the cost of photovoltaic cells on the left and electric vehicle batteries on the right. The solid line is the price actually that has been observed until 2016 or 17. And the dotted line is a projection. If the projection is right, then the cost of these electric vehicles is going to go down significantly in the future, therefore calling for a substitution for the regular fuel car. And as a result of that, there will be a decline in the demand for oil. Now, if these dotted lines don't materialize, then the substitution is going to be much slower than expected. So in a nutshell, oil participation in energy markets will decline relative to other forms of energy. Now, the IMF provides, and the World Bank provides long-term estimates of the prices of oil, coal, natural gas, and the combined energy index. And as you can see, even if nominal prices go slightly up, the real price for the following 15 or 20 years is going to be relatively flat. So the Washington institutions are expecting actually energy prices to be flat during the next 12 years or so. Okay, let me switch now to the Latin American part of all this. Contrary to you guys, and except for a couple of countries in Latin America, we are oil importers. Therefore, when the price is around 70, we're really much happier than when the price is 115. So we see the world the other way around, not as in the Middle East region where oil actually dictates otherwise. So what is my definition of new normal at this point? Having said that I don't see much new in what is going on and that I see risks for the future, but only risks, not certainties. My new normal is that punches are going to come from everywhere, to put it very mildly. Okay, let me say it more seriously. I would expect faster, continuous, deeper, and far-reaching changes and challenges to be the norm for policymakers, far more than what it used to be. So things like globalization on one hand, risks on the other hand, the fact that people are empowered by social media and the like will generate much faster change that we used to have. So the key issue is in what policy environment do you prefer to design and implement policies to face such changes and challenges at the speed at which we are seeing. And this is where the Latin American part comes into the talk, because at this point, my friend Ibrahim is looking at me saying, well, where is Latin America? Okay. Being Chilean and being very orthodox, I would prefer an environment with a lot of macroeconomic institutions that could sustain growth. And I'm going to talk about these institutions in a minute. I would like to have fiscal responsibility because my country and all the rest of the countries in Latin America has been historically fiscal irresponsible. So I would like to have fiscal responsibility in there in the forms of rules and monitoring those rules. The second one is that I would like to have monetary responsibility, despite the fact that the mandate of the central bank was to control inflation and keep inflation at least single digits. That's the original law of the central bank that was, of course, never enforced. So I would like to have targets, and I would like to have a clear indication of what is going on in the exchange market and what kind of exchange regimes you would like to have. But I also would like to have intertemporal responsibility, because it's very easy to spend the money of the future generations today and then let the future generation deal with the problem. And we've seen that over and over again. And we have a track record of banking crisis and balance of payment crisis, which is horrendous. So I would like to see their sovereign wealth funds, central bank reserves, and foreign direct investment of Latin American countries in other regions of the world. Can the Latin American experience be of any use for MENA? That was the key challenge of this talk. And what I did is the following. I selected 32 countries of MENA and LAC, Latin America and the Caribbean. I dropped desperate cases. I dropped Venezuela, basically because you cannot trust the data if there is any data available. And I dropped Libya for the same reason. I couldn't find decent data on that. And I classified the countries according to macroeconomic institutions. Here are the countries, 18 MENA countries. The list is there. I'm not going to go over that. 14 Latin American countries. I would say that with the exception of Venezuela, all of them are the important ones. Maybe a few were left out for one reason or another. And the second column is whether these countries are oil or gas exporters. We have 3 countries in Latin America exporting gas and oil. Ecuador makes significant amounts of gas and oils. Bolivia, Ecuador, and Mexico. Chile is now exporting gas to Argentina, even though we don't produce any gas. We import the gas from Indonesia and then transfer it to Argentina using the pipelines that we built 20 years ago. So we are not really exporters. But we do sell in Argentina, which is nice. Some of the countries have fixed exchange rates. Ecuador, Panama, and El Salvador in Latin America, they have dollarized economies. Therefore, they don't have a central bank. They don't. The central bank is just an exchange unit. Some of the countries in Latin America are doing inflation targeting, 6 of them, which are there, and 2 in MENA, Israel and Turkey. And some of the countries have fiscal rules, 2 in MENA and 8 or 9 in Latin America. Okay?
So, you have 5 minutes.
Oh, I'll make it, don't worry. I think. Maybe not. Okay, so I focus on the performance after the global recession, and I focus on the real exchange rates, GDP growth, inflation, the classic macroeconomic things. I take a look to fixed and floating exchange regimes to see if they adjust better or not to the shock and afterwards the recovery. I look at inflation targeters and fiscal rulers, countries with inflation targeting and countries with fiscal rules in place. Okay? So if you look at real exchange rate by region, they actually move very similar during the last 15 or 20 years. So there's nothing to learn from the geographical point of view. The fact that countries in Latin America and in MENA behave the same indicates that there's nothing to learn there. And if you take a look between natural resource-rich countries and those which are not, there is a little more volatility for the resource-rich countries, but the real exchange rate more or less the same. I concentrate on the real exchange rate at the beginning because this indicates whether the country is able to move from one traded sector to the non-traded sector, which would have been the case during the build-up of the crisis, and therefore afterwards the other way around. If you look by exchange regime, nothing there. A little less tendency to appreciation in countries with a floating regime, but nothing else. Where the big difference is in the conduct of monetary policy. And here what we have is that countries which are inflation targeters were able to depreciate their real exchange rate much faster after the crisis. And this is a significant decline in the real exchange rate of about 20%, 15%, depending on the country. And these are the 8 countries that actually have inflation targeting. So inflation targeting countries were able to deal with the crisis in a much faster and less costly way. So that's one thing which is important to bear in mind. The second one is that these inflation targeting countries had much higher growth than the rest of the countries. So something is there that allowed the countries to grow faster and with much less sacrifice, but you can go very fast if you invest 50% of the GDP. But actually, the inflation targeting countries invest less and grow faster than the non-inflation targeting countries. Of course, they have lower inflation. They are targeting inflation, and therefore they tend to have lower. But more important than lower inflation is that it is far more stable than in the other countries, indicating less cost of adjustment. Unemployment rate much lower. And this is an important issue because after the crisis, the unemployment rates shot up in most countries except for the very fast adjustment in inflation targeters. A much better current account balance. The blue line is the inflation targeting countries. The red line is the non-inflation targeted country. You see how the current account worsens over time. But if you are an oil exporter, the worsening of the current account is even higher and much more dramatic than in the rest of the countries. And your primary deficit in inflation targeting countries is very much controlled, under control, whilst in the other countries is not, and they deteriorate significantly, increasing, of course, the debt. And one thing that we discussed yesterday in the macro sessions, the pro-cyclicality of government expenditures is much lower in countries with fiscal rules than in the rest of the countries. So these institutions are buying the things that we would like to see after a shock of the size of the global depression. One thing is that is interesting from these 8 countries is that whilst all of them are inflation targeters, not all of them have fiscal rules, not all of them have fiscal councils, some of them have sovereign wealth funds, and not all of them have floating exchange regimes. So you can have some of these benefits, you don't need to buy the entire package. You don't need to buy the entire set of macroeconomic institutions. So what we'd like from this framework is the following. We would like to have institutions aiming at reducing and controlling interest conflicts and objective conflicts between the politicians and the citizens that can actually control the discretion of government policies, in particular of fiscal policy, that would ameliorate the problem of short-term focusing and myopia of the authorities, that could isolate somewhat the management of these macro institutions from political cycles and from instability, and that would add what is much needed everywhere, is reducing information asymmetry and the lack of transparency in the conduct of macroeconomic policies in general. There are common components for these institutions that one would like to see. One is clear, simple rules and policies. Clear mandates for the authorities so that we can actually monitor what they're doing and assess if they're actually dealing with the situation properly. Clean escape clauses. If you have a rule, you have to have a way to break the rule, but it has to be regulated. Otherwise, the rule becomes a sort of a cage, and it cannot be necessarily optimal for all situations. We need transparency and information procedures, and the most important thing is to coordinate and anchor expectations to whatever is reasonable and attainable. What is the empirical evidence? I have a paper with Bassem Kamar on inflation reduction and stabilization as a result of having inflation targeting in there. I have another paper with Klaus Schmidt-Hebel on fiscal rules, another one with Ibrahim El-Badawi. All these papers show that in one way or another, these macroeconomic institutions lead to inflation reduction and to price stabilization, to enhance growth and sustainability, to stabilize the exchange rate, and to reduce the procyclicality and to enhance the fiscal sustainability. There's a bunch of papers in there. I can be very happy to give you all the references if needed be, but there is mounting evidence that actually these institutions deliver the promise of a more stable and more sustainable macroeconomic policy. What are the policy questions left for the authorities? What is the appropriate the institutional design? This changes in every country, and it would depend on things like if the country is a federal system or a unitary system, if the country has a variety of characteristics that are proper of each country, whether it's oil price located in one region or not the other. That kind of thing will be very important. What are the definition of goals? How big is going to be the fiscal surplus or the fiscal deficit that we would like to have if we're targeting 3% of inflation, or as in Brazil, 8% of inflation at the beginning, and then lowering down to 2% or 3% nowadays? Are these goals compatible? Can we have a 2% inflation target with a 5% fiscal deficit? Is it sustainable? Is it reasonable? What can be given priority? What are the policy instruments? And what is the sequencing of this? Do we have to have first inflation targeting and then fiscal rules, or the other way around? Can we have it simultaneously? All these kind of things depends on the characteristic, proper characteristic of each country, and therefore it's very difficult to anticipate what's the. And then the final thing is that you have to have policy coordination, because you have to take day-to-day operations and strategic long horizon planning, and those things need a lot of coordination between the central bank and the other economic authorities. So since I am over due in time, thank you very much for your time, and I hope this sparkles the discussion.